Cops and other law enforcement people, what were some cases you worked on that made you think, even if for a moment, that something supernatural/paranormal was going on? A crazy old woman called because she heard someone repeatedly banging on her front door and garage door. It's after midnight and I get there and the house is in the middle of the woods with nothing around for miles. I talk to the lady and she insists I check her large shed out back. So I open the shed door and peek in with my flashlight, and the entire shed is filled with creepy large homemade dolls. They're each probably like 2 to 3 feet tall and sitting upright facing the door. The hair on my neck went up for a minute. I didn't truly believe that something supernatural was going on, but dolls are just really effing creepy. I'm a second-generation firefighter. My father spent the latter days of his career as a fire safety director at a massive mental asylum. Our state version of OSHA has to come and do inspections at all facilities. His was no exception, so the OSHA inspectors made their way to an abandoned part of the facility that used to house the criminally insane, the absolute worst of the worst. Serial killers, aurists, cannibals, etc. My father left them with the keys and a flashlight because the electricity didn't work. The inspectors were radioing back to my father that they kept hearing talking and footsteps, which was impossible. Not even squatters could move around because each section is isolated with locked doors to prevent escape. Eventually, the inspectors give up and actually flee without finishing. My dad decides to stick around and check the alarm boxes they didn't. As he is checking one of the alarms, he feels as if someone is watching him from down the hall. As he looks, a shadow forms with a head, shoulders, torso, but no legs, and just 2 holes where there should be eyes. My dad noped the hell on out of there. Since the hospital is shut down, it's been on Ghost Adventures, Ghost Hunters, and on a myriad of other shows and movies. My dad has been in some of them. Jason from Ghost Hunters called it the scariest place he's ever investigated. As a skeptic, I like to tell myself that between the design, lack of light, and possibility of infrasound or something causing dread and mild hallucination, that those places aren't haunted. But I can also tell you if I were there, I would be terrified. So I guess I'm not a great skeptic. Cop, real call. I've been on patrol for several years and love stuff like this. I had a backup officer with me who witnessed everything. Dispatch sent me to a call in a mountain area late one night. Dispatch said the caller reported several people holding a baby above their heads and chanting while standing on her property. The call sounded ridiculous, and I smirked as dispatch gave the details. I arrived at the proper address after driving about 20 minutes along a mountain road. There's not much else up here, and it was extremely quiet. No one walks around out here, and there aren't very many cars driving this late. I walked along a gated driveway through a light wooded area. I found the caller's house with 2 dim lights near the front door. The house was surrounded on 3 sides by heavy woods. I felt a little uneasy just looking at the house. I knocked on the front door of the house while standing on a large patio. I heard something move to my left, which startled me because it was close. It sounded like a person, something big. I looked to my left and used my flashlight to light up the patio. I didn't see anyone. I continued to knock. I could hear 2 voices inside the house. I clearly heard a male and a female. This made me feel a little better. I thought I heard someone on the patio, but it must have been someone inside. The female eventually opened the door. She was terrified, almost crying. She asked me to come inside and close the door. She led me to the living room where I saw a very cheap security monitor, almost like a baby monitor camera setup with audio and video playing. The camera setup only provided a live feed. The camera was positioned to view the front door and patio area where I was just standing. The audio was silent as I watched the monitor for a few seconds. The woman began to explain when I interrupted and asked where the male was inside the house. I heard his voice. She looked confused and said she was here alone. I was surprised because I know for a fact I heard a male's voice when I knocked. I asked her several times and initially thought she was lying to me. My partner checked the house and did not find anyone. The woman said she was reading while sitting on the couch when she heard something over the security camera. She looked at the display and saw 2 people on the patio standing at the front door. She heard knocking on the door and called the police. I looked at the monitor, and although it was low quality, I could see the patio and front door area with decent clarity. As the woman continued to explain, the audio on the monitor went from quiet to extremely loud. We all stopped talking. The caller was shaking. I looked at the monitor but didn't see anyone. Loud audio continued to blast from the speakers. The audio sounded like wind, but it was not windy that night. I asked the woman, "What is that?" and she said, "It's them." I looked at my partner, who was nervous. The woman gives me her cell phone, stating she took pictures of the monitor showing the two people on her patio. I looked through several low-quality pics and didn't see anything. I continued to scroll, and sure enough, I see what looks like two tall figures standing at the door. One of the figures is holding something. The figure looked strange, all dark and featureless in contrast to the video I saw on the monitor. I was in disbelief and thought, oh my God, she's telling the truth. I continued to scroll and saw one figure holding something up over its head. Another picture showed the item at the base of the door with both figures standing near it. I tried to reason to explain what could have caused these images, but it was pretty apparent that there had been two subjects on her patio. We checked outside, walking the property to the tree line. I mentioned the movement on the patio and the male voice from inside the house. My partner asks me to stop talking about it. We finish checking and return to speak with the caller. She says she will be driving into town and staying at a hotel because she is too scared to stay here tonight. We walk along the driveway back to our cars. My partner jumps into the patrol car and takes off. I laughed, but I felt really uneasy standing there in the dark. I leave shortly afterward. I mean, I don't know if this is real or not, but I will say this. It definitely has my interest. Frankly, if this were the start to a horror movie, consider me invested. EMS here. We went on a difficult breathing call. We showed up and the poor patient had been a cancer patient, and she had literally coughed up chunks of her lungs all over the bathroom. She was obviously dead, laying there against her toilet. My partner straightened up all of a sudden and said, "Can you feel that? She's still here." I was like, "Well, of course she is, moron. She's right there." And he turns and looks at the door frame and says, "No, she's not left yet. She's right there watching us." I could feel the hair rise on the back of my neck, but I couldn't see anything. But of course, after someone says that, it was impossible for me not to dismiss the feeling like someone else was watching. The bastard doctor made us work her too, spent the entire time doing CPR and doing what I could while apologizing on the way to the ER. Not paranormal, really just something I always remember that makes me laugh. Starting out in the fire service, get an alarm drop at an old building late at night that has stories of being haunted. Supposedly was used as a prison during the Civil War, lots of executions, etc. My captain was a middle-aged black guy, funny as hell. We finished searching the first and second floor, and captain relays to command, nothing found. Command tells us to go to the attic and make sure it is clear there as well. Captain copies the orders, then just stands there. I'm still new, so I don't question it. We stand there for 5 minutes in silence until the captain goes over to the radio again and says, "We checked it, all clear." Captain looks at me and says, "The F I'm going up there. This ain't the horror movie where the black guy dies today." He did say later when I brought it up that he had been in there before for an alarm drop and 2 water fountains turned on when he walked past them. I'm a medic and worked a short time as an emergency room medic in Detroit. Hated the job, but it was a good experience to have. Anyways, one night about 3 to 4 a.m., we get a radio report from the police. They are coming in with a patient and to meet them in the ambulance bay with a stretcher. Police usually do not transport patients. EMS does that. So I figured it was an officer that was hurt or sick. Got out to the ambulance bay and wait for them. They pull up and jump out of the squad car and yell, "He's in the back!" I start asking questions while trying to assess the patient. The patient is stiff as a board. I don't mean like he was dead and in rigor. We were able to pick him up and carry him like a backboard. The police tell us they were called to a homeless shelter for a disturbance. They got there and this guy was standing in the middle of the room with all the others kneeling to the floor in a circle around them. He was chanting and no one even paid attention to the police. The police weren't sure what was going on, but for whatever reason decided this guy needed medical attention. As we get him in a room, he is completely unaware of his surroundings, still chanting. The charge nurse asks if I can understand what he is saying, and I realized what it was. He was performing voodoo. His chant/prayer was a mix of Christianity and African folklore. I'm certainly not an expert, but I recognized it. A lot of the nurses were freaked out and did their best to avoid that room. The only time he stopped chanting, he looked right at me and said demons would come for me. I am not religious at all and dismissed the whole thing as just an altered mental status. But the next night, I was walking by that room and a psych patient had taken his sheet off the bed. When I walked past, he jumped out and tried to strangle me with it. A nurse and aide were able to tackle him off me. We restrained him to the bed and sedated him, but he said, "I told you I was going to get you." Not gonna lie, that would be enough to make me think about my beliefs for a long time. I mean, I can look at that and the situation and easily tell myself that it's just a coincidence, but if I were actually in that situation, you would have a harder time convincing me. I used to run a shop on a busy retail street where all the shop managers had set up a network of radios to keep track of shoplifters and other security risks. We would all meet up once a year in person to discuss local characters and best practice when it comes to security. And one year it became apparent that we were all being targeted by a homeless guy who was trying to sneak into back office areas just before closing to spend the night. Harsh as it is, we obviously all had to kick him out when we found him, but nobody wanted to report him to the police, because he was always apologetic and understanding when we had to ask him to leave. Occasionally, he would head straight to another shop to try his luck, so we got into the habit of calling it in over the radio. One night after I had escorted him out of the fire escape, I took my time getting back to the radio, and when I did, I found that 4 other shops were discussing the fact that they just kicked him out of theirs within 5 minutes of each other, which simply wouldn't be possible along a street that long. Nobody ever saw him again, and it became a bit of a running joke that he died somewhere, and we'd all kicked his ghost out. I worked as a switchboard operator at the hospital. It's weird, on the overnights, every time I work, I'll get calls from way outside our area numbers. Some will even say out of area when they call. 1-700 and 1-980 numbers. Only on the night shift, there's no one there, just silence or sometimes a light buzz. One time it was the sound of a bustling room. I'm convinced it's some ghost of diseased patients calling in. The freakiest one was when we had a code and boom, ghost call. Sure enough, that patient passed. Okay, I'm gonna need more of a description than bustling room because that can mean a lot of things. Like, did it sound windy? Like, there was a party? Something else? Some options are creepy and some sound like pranksters. Not a cop or law enforcement, but one night in the animal ER, the cat that was in the hospital started to die. Her owner had just called saying they would be in there in about 10 minutes to visit. I was a student at the time, so after the doc pronounced her dead, I stayed with her and petted her while telling her that mom and dad were coming. It had only been about 3 minutes since the doc pronounced her, but she began breathing again. She lived until her parents got there and then died in her mom's arms. My mom worked as a nurse practitioner at Denver County Jail back when I was in middle school. I remember one day when she came home early because she was pretty shaken up. She had gotten into work and started beginning of her shift duties, which included looking over the charts of any inmates currently in the ward. She passed one of the self-termination watch cells, basically a concrete block with a bench and a drain on the floor, and noticed that there was a man inside. He was in prison garb, but my mom didn't recognize him, so she asked him his name, but he didn't respond. There was no chart, so she went and asked the officer on duty with her where the guy's chart was. The officer basically thought she was effing with him because no one had been in that cell for a few days. She went back to the cell with the officer, and there was no one there. None of the other staff knew what she was talking about, and nothing was on the security footage. My mom is the most secular, scientific person I know, and it really freaked her out. She didn't like being alone anywhere in the jail after that. I used to work overnight in a hospital, and creepy things happened all the time. Call lights go off in unoccupied rooms, footsteps behind me in long dark halls, the smell of weird perfumes when no one is around, and those are just the little things. One night I heard my coworker call for me. I came around the corner to the nurse's station and she's MIA. I assumed she had run something to a room. I go about my rounds and when I finally run into her, ask her what she needed. She said she didn't need anything and she'd been on break and never said my name or called out to me. I argued for a few minutes until I realized she had no reason to lie. But I heard it plain as day. Still creeps me out when I think about it. Another place you want to avoid at night is the morgue. This is one of those things where I just think about all the electronics and infrasound that could be in a hospital and just the general mood and long hours. Hallucinations happen, people, and you might say they absolutely felt too real to be a hallucination. Yeah, that's what a powerful hallucination does. Not a cop or law enforcer, but I worked at a funeral home all throughout college. I don't usually believe in the paranormal, but there were a couple of times I questioned it. There's this one time that stands out more than any other experience. Usually when I was working, it was to work after normal funeral home hours at a viewing/rosary. This usually meant I was there until dark by myself. Our funeral home was also an old house that always gave me a creepy vibe. My routine for closing was to turn off all the lights, make sure the crematory was off/cleaned with no one in there, close any open caskets, transfer the phones, and lock the door. There was this one time I was in a viewing room turning off all the lights. It was a mid-40s man in one of our viewing rooms. Now, normally, an embalmed body has their eyelids shut. Our funeral home used what amounts to sticky contacts that would hold the eyes shut. As I was turning off the last light, out of the corner of my eye, I saw the light reflecting off of an eyeball. This is nearly impossible and made all the hair stand up on my neck. I turned around, and I swear on my parents' grave it looked like that man was looking right at me. He had the glassy eyes of a dead person, and his mouth was still sewn with a slight smile. His head was turned slightly, and his eyes were wide open. Instead of being the good funeral home employee and checking it out, I sprinted out of there. I immediately called my boss and told her what I saw. She said not to worry about closing the casket, but to transfer the phones and go. She didn't believe a word I said. Going back in was tough. As I was in the front office, I was holding the phone, shaking, and continually checking around the corner for anything. I was so scared I called my roommate while I finished transferring. Didn't open the next day. They checked the body and nothing was off. His eyes were shut and his neck wasn't rotated. My boss made fun of me for a good couple of months after that. I can't explain what I saw, but it could have been due to tiredness or my brain playing tricks in the dark. Either way, I will never forget that experience. Not me, but my dad. He was a cop in New York City for years. One night he's called to an apartment building where a man had seemingly passed out, possibly from a heart attack. He was also a paramedic. Him and his partner show up, and the wife answers the door and takes them into the apartment. The guy is sitting in his chair in the living room, completely unconscious. They figure out it's not a heart attack and it's low blood pressure, so they're about to administer something to him, and suddenly he jumps up and stares at them. However, he wasn't really staring at them, more behind them, like he didn't even know they were there. He then began pacing back and forth, speaking in some sort of tongue, screaming and pointing like it's a scene in a war movie where the general is inspiring his troops before they go into battle. He's waving his hand, pumping his fist, chanting, shouting his head off, and not a single person in the room has any idea what was going on. Then, just as suddenly as it began, he sits back in his chair and passes out again. When he came to, they asked him if he spoke any language other than English, which he didn't. His wife yelled at him that they'd met in Spanish class, but he admitted he didn't remember much of it. He said no one in his immediate family spoke any language either, as they'd all been born in America. My dad and his partner left believing that they had just seen an episode of a previous life taking over the current body in an attempt at self-preservation. My dad tells it better, and I figure I messed up a few points, but that's more or less the gist of it. I was an intern for my city's SUV unit. Because I didn't have my own car, my dad would drop me off on his way to work, and so I was normally in the building before the detectives arrived. One morning, I wasn't the first one there. The detective that had been assigned the first call was there. So I was starting up the coffee when I heard screaming and banging from the interview room. I peeked through the one-way window, and I saw a middle-aged guy smashing the chair against the wall while screaming. I went and told the detective what the guy was doing, and he told me the guy had been doing that on and off since he had been brought in. The detective told me the guy had no criminal record and no history of mental health problems, but early that morning the guy had broken into his sister's home, stabbed her, choked her, arred her, tied a rope around her neck, and then threw her out a window. The guy wouldn't talk, he just kept screaming and breaking things. He wasn't even a suspect until his sister regained consciousness and identified him. Last I heard, she was alive but is paralyzed from the neck down. He committed self-termination in jail. No one knew why he did it. Please leave your story in the comments. I would love to make a video on them in the future. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe.